Welcome to the Legal Influence Podcast, a show for influencers and content creators looking to grow thriving and influential businesses legally. I'm your host, Kate Cooper. I'm an attorney, content creator, and owner of the Legal Influence. And in today's episode, I'm going to talk about a hot topic when it comes to brand deals and licensing content to brands, and that is granting usage rights in perpetuity, and what creators really need to know about those magical words. But before I dive in, I do have to provide some quick disclaimers. Nothing that I share today is legal advice. Everything I share is for informational and educational purposes only. While I am an attorney, I am not your attorney, and listening to this episode does not create an attorney-client relationship between us. So today I'm going to talk about what influencers and content creators really need to consider before giving usage rights to brands in perpetuity. And ultimately, you are free to decide what types of partnerships you take on and what types of terms you agree to when working with brands. Unless you're my client personally, I can't tell you whether or not you should give usage rights or should not give usage rights to a brand in perpetuity. But I can give you the information that you need to know in order to make an informed decision about your business for yourself. And at the end of the day, as I always say, brand deals should be mutually beneficial. And I believe that a big part of making brand deals mutually beneficial is providing creators with the knowledge they need in order to make those informed decisions. So, another consideration is the fact that if a brand is requesting usage rights in perpetuity, they need to be paying you adequately for those rights. And because of the nature of what perpetual usage rights are, that should be a substantial amount of money. We're talking minimum 5 figures. But let me rewind back up for a minute, because you may be listening to this and you might be wondering, what on earth are you talking about, Kate? What does in perpetuity even mean? So to put it simply, in perpetuity means forever. So in the context of a brand deal, this type of language is going to come up in the licensing and usage provision in your contract. So if you create content while working with a brand and the brand gets the right to use that content, the terms of that use need to be outlined in your contract. And essentially what you're doing here is you're giving the brand a license to use your content. And there's a lot of information that can and should go into the license, like how the brand can use the content, where the brand can use it, and the relevant piece here, how long can the brand use your content for? And if the answer to that in the contract says in perpetuity, that just means that the brand can use the content forever. You may also see the word perpetual, and that has the same meaning. And again, the other language in that licensing provision will dictate things like how it can be used. And I will link to a blog post about usage rights in the show notes. And that post is going to go more in depth on what usage rights are and give you some of the important language that you need to know to look out for as a creator. So here are some things that you need to keep in mind when it comes to giving a brand usage rights in perpetuity. So the first one is going to be obvious. The brand can use your content forever. But what does that actually mean? So remember, you're not going to live forever. And a brand, a business, could very well possibly outlive you. And by giving them usage rights in perpetuity, you're potentially allowing them to continue to use your content beyond the grave. And depending on the full scope of the licensing terms, they may be able to profit from the use of your content forever, particularly if paid usage rights are involved. They may even be able to sell the content to other people or use it in other capacities, and you have no control over this. You're giving up control over your content forever. And it's very likely that this content is going to feature your image and likeness, and I'll discuss a little bit more about that in a bit. But when you're giving up the rights to your content forever, you're giving away something huge. Now, on the flip side of things, does a brand need the right to use your content forever? No, Absolutely not. Their contract is going to be drafted to be as broad as possible and squeeze as much blood from the stone as they can with as little in return. But if you were to actually ask a brand how they plan to use your content, they probably don't need a license that is beyond a few months, maybe up to a year. And in the event that a brand is running an ad and the content is just performing super well after that period of time is up, then the brand can go back to you and renegotiate a new license. And if that's the case, they want to keep using your content and putting ad dollars behind it because that content is so good that they are profiting from running those ads, then you should absolutely be compensated appropriately for the continued use of that content, which means, charging them more than you did in the first place. And when you give a brand usage rights in perpetuity, you're giving that all up because they don't ever have to come back to the table, even if it's performing super well and they're making millions of dollars from it. So that's one of the biggest risks of granting usage rights in perpetuity. You're potentially leaving money on the table, and you probably don't want to be giving all of that up. So the next thing to keep in mind when considering whether or not to grant usage rights in perpetuity is that you don't know what's going to happen in the future, which means you don't know what's going to happen to you and what the value of your image and likeness may be in the future. And you also don't know what's going to happen to the brand in the future. So think about the brands that you loved 10 years ago. How many of those brands do you still love today? There may be some that you're still a raving fan of, but chances are you've probably changed and evolved, and the brands and businesses that you support probably have also changed and evolved with you. I know 10 years ago in 2014, I was going to the mall every weekend and shopping at fast fashion stores like Forever 21 and H&M, and 2014 Kate would have leapt at the opportunity to work with one of those brands. But 2024 Kate would never want to be associated with brands like that because I have more knowledge about how those businesses operate, the impacts they have, and they just don't reflect my values. But what if I gave them content with usage rights in perpetuity back in 2014? And they decide to run a little throwback campaign highlighting influencers from back in the day, and they decide to use that content. I'm now tied to a brand that I don't want to be associated with, and I don't have any control over it. And this may sound like a far-fetched scenario, and realistically, a brand probably won't dive into the archives for old content in the future. That kind of highlights why they don't really need to have the usage rights in perpetuity in the first place. But even if it's unlikely, it can happen. You don't know what a brand may do. And again, you won't have any control over it without potentially going back to the brand and trying to renegotiate and paying them to get those rights back. So along the same lines, you don't know what's going to happen to you in the future. You may blow up as an influencer or a creator and amass millions of followers. You may become famous in other respects. You may write a book. Maybe you run for political office. Maybe you just want to exit public life completely and you don't want to be associated with any brands ever again. And what makes content licensing unique for UGC creators and influencers specifically is that your image and likeness is prominently featured in your content. And you're not being featured in that content as a model or an actor playing a character. That content features you. You are endorsing the brand and product. And so again, you don't know what the value of your image and likeness and your endorsements may be in the future. So the considerations around how long a brand can use your content is very unique, especially compared to, that of a traditional brand photographer who's shooting product shots. And let me tell you, that brand photographer is still going to be charging a pretty penny for perpetual usage rights, even though their image and likeness isn't being factored into the equation. So when you are your content, that needs to be factored into the rates that you're charging and taken into consideration when it comes to how long a brand can actually use the content featuring you. So generally speaking, when a brand gets usage rights to content that features your image and likeness, there's going to also be some sort of image and likeness provision, either referenced with the licensing and usage provision. Maybe it's in its own provision, but it's going to give the brand the right to use your image and likeness for the same duration of time that they have the right to use your content. And this is known as publicity rights. And again, just like the content rights, these rights are valuable. And so it's something to keep in mind when you are giving that away to a brand for as long as a period of time as forever. Another big consideration, this kind of ties into what I was just talking about with publicity rights, but when you give a brand usage rights in perpetuity, it could potentially limit your ability to work with other brands in the future because of either direct conflicts with exclusivity provisions, or just because a brand doesn't want to work with a creator who is being featured or associated with a competitor brand. So turning to the exclusivity issues, let's say you do a campaign with Pepsi. So you create content for Pepsi, and in your contract, you give Pepsi the right to use that content in paid ads in perpetuity, and we're going to assume that content features your image and likeness. And let's say 3 years go by, you go through a kind of major lifestyle change, and you're now super into wellness. You stopped drinking Pepsi a long time ago, but you still love soda, and so you love Poppy. And let's assume you've also grown as a creator during this time. You brought your audience along for the journey of your lifestyle change, and now they're more engaged than ever. So you reach out to Poppy to see if they're interested in working with you. They are. They love your content. They're willing to pay you more than Pepsi did because, again, you've now grown and evolved as a creator and you can offer them more value. But they want to include an exclusivity provision that includes any soda brand, so the entire category. Now, you might not be actively working with Pepsi right now, but Pepsi still has content featuring you that they can use in paid ads whenever they want. And if they do that, that looks like it's an endorsement of Pepsi from you, and that may create issues with the exclusivity that Poppy is now looking for. Now, is Pepsi going to be using your content 3 years down the line? Probably not, but it could get you into hot water if they do. And when you agree to the terms in your contract, you want to make sure that you can actually follow through with and carry out all of your obligations under the contract. And you really shouldn't be agreeing to terms that you could potentially breach in the event that a third party does something that is out of your control. Now, in this situation, you would obviously want to go back to the table, talk to Poppy, explain your past history with Pepsi, and then let them assess the risk and potentially rework that exclusivity provision so that Pepsi is either carved out or the scope of the exclusivity is limited to current work or new work. But it does put you in kind of an awkward position. And Poppy may also decide that, hey, they don't want to take that risk and be associated with someone who has a connection to Pepsi. So keep in mind, I do want to note, these are all hypothetical situations. I don't know anything about what goes on behind the scenes in the influencer marketing departments at Poppy or Pepsi, but I just want to highlight some of the considerations of why giving a brand usage rights in perpetuity is such a big deal. And the potential impacts of being tied to a brand forever should definitely be taken into consideration when you're making that decision. So, all the things I just discussed, the loss of control over the use of your content, the potential lost revenue, the potential issues with exclusivity, that all highlights why perpetual usage rights are so valuable and why a brand should be prepared to pay a substantial amount of money for those rights. I'm also a firm believer that if a brand is going to ask for usage rights, specifically paid usage rights in perpetuity, they should be disclosing that to you upfront when deliverables are being discussed. It should never be a surprise that suddenly pops up in the contract. I understand why licensing and usage provisions are drafted so broadly in a brand's stock influencer or creator contract, but that's a material term that needs to be discussed with the creator. And ideally, there should be some flexibility to negotiate a more limited term that is more appropriate for both the brand's needs and the brand's budget. And if a brand doesn't bring up usage rights in negotiations, I always encourage creators to bring it up on your own to avoid those surprises. And one last thing, this one's a little blunt, but oftentimes the brands that are sneaking in these usage rights in perpetuity are the ones that don't have anywhere near the budget necessary to be asking for those rights. They're the ones trying to nickel and dime you over, $100. And so brands will also try to sneak usage rights and perpetuity into contracts for gifted collabs. And these things just aren't okay. They're big red flags. So I really hope today's episode helps shed some light on why brands asking for usage rights and perpetuity is such a big deal. So thanks so much for listening to Legal Influence Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review. It really helps grow the show. And if you know any influencers or content creators who would benefit from this episode, please send it on to them. Talk to you soon.